Hello, everyone. Today we have Dr. Darwin Reicks, and we'll chat about the 5 biggest changes in boar studs in the last 25 years. So, how are you, Dr. Reicks?
I'm well.
Thanks for your time again. If you can share with us a little bit of your career so far, and also how you got involved in the swine industry, and then we can get rolling into the topic.
Well, I grew up on a pig farm in northeast Iowa and went to Iowa State for animal science, graduated in 1990, and then went to vet school and graduated in 1994. So I've been in practice 26 years this week.
Wow.
And I was in a larger practice for 22 years, and I've been started Reicks Veterinary Research and Consulting for about 4 years ago. Doing mostly the same thing for most of my career. I've been working with and managing boar studs for about 25 years. I've been working with air filtration since about 2015, 2014, 2015. And I have a reference lab for quality control for semen analysis. I'm in my 17th year doing that. And then I also have a research farm. I've done a lot of small projects, mostly with boars, viral shedding, different diseases in boars, but also sows, pregnant sows, and quite a bit with PRRS, but also PED, 𝘰𝗵𝘄𝗏, Seneca virus.
A lot of different diseases. Very nice, very, very nice career, and very unique too, right? Not many folks specializing in boars, so that's great. So for the last 25 years, Darwin, what are the 5 biggest changes in boar studs?
Yeah, I would say I kind of boiled it down to 5 big changes. The first being control of PRRS. That was kind of a landmark innovation and led to control of other diseases. Secondly, I think ventilation. The filtration and air conditioning in particular, a lot of changes there with boar studs. The third is the quality control, the use of independent third-party labs to have kind of unbiased information with bacteria and sperm counts and quality control. I would say post-cervical artificial insemination. Been 2 big waves of that, but that's certainly changed the way boar studs operate. And then the last, 𝘵𝘵𝘢 management. I think has been a big change with boar studs.
Very good. Those are a lot of great areas to dive on. So PRRS, what are your comments on that over time?
Well, with PRRS, I think it was quite a change. A lot of people probably don't know even that most boar studs were PRRS positive up through about the year 2000, 2001. And then in other countries, even as recently as the last 5 to 10 years, some studs were operating on a PRRS positive status. The main reason was that the source, in those days, the sourcing was positive. So when a lot of the genetic companies here in North America, some of the bigger companies did PRRS eradications in the late 90s, then we followed that with closures and eradications in boar studs. Then over the next few years, we started to see breaks in boar studs and shedding in the semen. So I did a couple big projects, 2003, 2004, and published those, showing that the current procedure of monitoring semen was not effective in identifying early detection. And in the second study, we used a different strain. We used a field strain. I believe that's one of the first studies where someone used a field strain. Up until that time, pretty much everyone would use kind of the same strain, so then they could reference that same strain in their papers. So we found that there was a lot of difference between strains, and that serum was the best sample for early detection. So that led to a lot of other studies that I did looking at early detection for other agents. With a boar stud, if we don't detect it early and the cows are out of the barn, so to speak, if you're already sending out virus, monitoring from a historical perspective really doesn't do you any good for prevention. So I think that was a huge change. There's been a lot of cost, of course, in monitoring boar studs. But fortunately, I think that problem of boar studs infecting sow farms through the semen has largely been resolved.
Very nice. We have in our audience over 25 countries that listen to our episodes, Dr. Reicks. So if anyone that is listening has a PRRS positive boar stud, can you walk us through a little bit, maybe just the highlights on the, how to eradicate, if that's okay?
Yeah, the risk in operating a PRRS positive or other disease positive that can transmit in the semen, which there's a number of viral agents and some bacterial agents. The risk in doing so, especially with some of the viral agents like PRRS, is the shedding is intermittent, and it's not really very closely tied with clinical signs. So I've done quite a few different studies in the early phases with PRRS virus, and quite often you see shedding in the semen about the same time or even just before you see symptoms in the boars. So that was a problem, a huge problem in the early 2000s. Was in those days we were testing semen, or many people weren't testing at all. And the typical method for stud closure was a bunch of boars off feed with fever. Well, we know now, of course, everyone knows that it starts with 1 or 2 or 3 animals, and spreads slowly at first. And I think quite often we were, unknowingly, boar studs were sending out virus in the semen. So that's still the case today if there's a PRRS positive boar stud.
Very good. If we go to the second big change there in boar studs, so you mentioned ventilation. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think the first part of the changes with boar studs was driven largely from the PRRS shedding, and we had to find a way to filter the air coming in. There was a lot of good practical hands-on biosecurity research kind of in that 2000 to 2004, 2005 timeframe. And boar studs are pretty small facilities, really easy and quick to adapt those things, and we'd still see infections. And another advent at that time was the sequencing. We really didn't have sequencing prior to that era. Also, we started to see area spread with PRRS virus up until kind of that 2002 to 2004 time. We really didn't see whole neighborhoods getting infected. And then we had the sequencing. So on some of these breaks, we could trace it back to a neighbor, look at the weather data and see that was 100% match upwind. And so I had a number of those cases. So then we began to look at air filtration and the possibility of using a filter that could be put in place and not require like high pressure fans like HEPA filters require. So that was a big change. Then later, I think I had kind of started to think a lot about air conditioning. If we could use air conditioning, we could run the same wintertime ventilation rate year round, have a lot less filters, and then have the added benefit of heat stress in the summer. So there was only a few studs that were air conditioned up until that time. Largely, they were set up like a house where air would go through a cold air return, and or like a car when you're on max AC in your car, it just recirculates and recools air that's already been cooled. Those systems did not hold up at all. So we started to use systems that just use fresh air all the time. And that was a huge change for the industry, to have some security going in the summer, that the boars are going to make it through July, August, and September without massive heat stress losses. prior to that, we would often lose about 30%. That wouldn't be uncommon to lose 30% of the boars to bad semen quality. Not to death loss, because they show heat stress without, panting or death loss like that. The testicle just can't handle the kind of heat that we were seeing. So I think that was a huge change.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, heat stress in boar studs, it's definitely a tough one. I mean, a few years ago, we did a nutrition study there with different vitamins to see if we could minimize some of that, but we were not able to find much there at that time. So it's, ventilation, temperature is a big deal there. How about the next one, Dr. Reicks? Quality control in boar studs, how did that change over time?
Well, the quality control, up until about within the last 25 years, much of the quality control was really just done at the boar stud with motility checks. And so the thought was you'd distribute the semen, and then at the boar stud, or maybe even at the sow farms also, you put it under a microscope. If it's alive, it's good to go. And so people would check motility for out to 4 or 5 days. But often there would be, suboptimal fertility in different cases. And I want to credit, at least in North America here, Gary Althouse, when he was at Illinois, set up this QC lab and became kind of the gold standard. And now Chris Custer and my lab, we cross-reference each other, and so that there'd be unbiased, and that the labs would kind of police themselves. Prior to that time, if people had a fertility problem, they might send it in to the supplier of the extender, people that's selling in the extender, or they might run it up to the university, and the �々𝘗𝘗 would take a look at it. So people were getting a lot of variable information depending on one's perspective, and a lot of different types of reports. So kind of standardizing the reporting of that information, and I think that had a big difference. What we found was that there was a lot of bacterial contamination. My lab, I kind of geared up in 2003. The first couple of years there, we were seeing 20 to 25% of the samples coming in with bacterial contamination. So when the farms would get those reports back, they don't like that. They don't like to see all that contamination. Mm-hmm. And people are competitive, and so then you started to see people figure out solutions to bacterial contamination. What type of extender, collection technique. We're collecting boars completely different today than we did 25 years ago. 25 years ago, there was a double glove method, and where you would evacuate the prepuce and then extend the boar. There was a lot of enteric bacteria coming through the ejaculates. It was believed that raw semen was heavily contaminated. It's just not the case. Now we do a 3-glove technique, try to get free catch collections, and we get a lot of ejaculates that have undetectable amounts of bacteria nowadays. So it's been a huge change with that, and I think that all started kind of from these third-party labs.
You mentioned free catch collection. I think last time I collected a boar was 2009 or something. So can you just explain that to me? Maybe I don't know if it's the same thing or different. So
yep, it's something Chris Custer and I had worked on a lot. And the idea is you extend the boar with a paper towel in hand to kind of dry off the penis. Then there's a technique where you roll that one off and re-grab with a clean glove, and then you have really good traction. And in most cases, you're able to peel your fingers away and have the semen go directly from the boar's penis into the cup without running across the glove, without having any prepusal fluids in your hand. And even with the automated collection, we're able to modify that technique to try to get the semen directly from the urethra into the cup. That's really made a huge difference. Even if we have antibiotics or other control measures in place in the extenders, a lot of these bacteria produce toxins. Even if they're killed by the antibiotics, they're still can come with toxins. So that's really made a big difference in the quality of semen today versus 25 years ago.
Super interesting. Very nice. Anything else on quality control before we go to the next one?
Yeah, one more thing with the quality control also has been the toxicities. We really didn't 25 years ago think about various toxins that could be exposed to the semen. The only really toxin that was known at the time was the use of latex gloves sometimes, and a lot of people have heard about that. In reality, there's latex gloves that are not toxic, and there's vinyl gloves and nitro gloves that can be toxic. So that was some of the early eye-opener that even from lot to lot there can be variation. That led to some of discovery of toxins in the storage containers for the semen themselves. The packaging, such as the blister package, if there's toxins in the adhesives, it could potentially leach through the plastic and affect the DNA of the sperm. If there's cleaners used in the lab and there's residues, someone gets it on their finger, then it ends up in the semen. Those residues can cause acrosome damage and cell membrane damage that wouldn't be picked up on motility checks. So that's really been an advent in the last, I would say maybe 5 to 6 years, is looking for different toxins and their effects on the semen that we didn't have any idea about that 25 years ago.
Very interesting. So what was that big problem about 5 years ago we had in the industry? Was that diluent related, extended related, or what is that problem? If you can just walk us through it and what was learned from that.
Well, there's been a number of toxicity issues. There's probably 3 that are most widely known. 2 of them involve toxicity of plastics. And there was chemicals, in one case, a chemical called 𝘵𝘐 that was found doing liquid gas mass spec, and that altered the sperm in a way that did not affect the motility, but affected the fertility. So there's been a couple of cases of that. There's also been a situation with extenders. In all cases, these were inadvertent ingredient changes or use of a slight change in one chemical that was used that ultimately ended up affecting the total born and farrowing rates.
Yeah, very interesting. And that's one thing about the reproduction studies sometimes, right, is that a lot of times research labs don't have the ability or the time or resource to follow through to see what happens at total born level, fertility, farrowing rate, right?
That's right. Yeah.
You know, most motility and those things, morphology. So that's interesting. Do you see a trend or some of the labs trying to go all the way through with that, or it's still very tough?
It's a challenge. Ideally we do single sire matings and on every product, exposure to each product and take it all the way through to farrowing. But that's kind of a supply chain challenge. You got 4 months to get the results. So there's been a lot of attempts to find different tests where we could do the same thing by looking at tests, acrosomes, hypoosmotic swelling tests, different types of tests like that where we can catch most things, but in order to catch every possible difference, we need large numbers and single sire matings and just continuous ongoing research trials. So I think what's kind of the industry has gone to now is sort of backing up to the individual ingredient suppliers and trying to look at the quality control measures they have in place that go into some of these ingredients. The 3-glove method, a lot of that is to avoid the potential contamination with gloves, because we see a lot of variation with the collection gloves and materials. Sometimes we have lots come through that cause a lot of damage to the sperm. And so if we can just have the semen go directly from the penis into the collection bag and get it processed up, that avoids that whole step. I think there's going to be a lot more work done in the future also with different types of toxins, bacterial toxins, mycotoxins that we just don't know a lot about today.
Very good. So next one is what are the changes on post-cervical artificial insemination?
Yeah, that's post-cervical artificial insemination. Really is not a new technology. There was a lot of buzz about this in the late 90s and different experiments. There was kind of a landmark experiment out of England showing you could go down to lower counts. There was a lot of work in Spain looking at post-cervical or deep uterine, it was called at the time. Then there was catheters that were even longer that would go well up into the uterine horn, getting close to the site of fertilization. So there was a lot of work in those days and quite a bit of field studies that went on. The results were really variable, and that was caused a lot of frustration. There'd be these massive success stories, and then there'd be other failures. So while some areas in the world adapted these techniques, there was a lot of hesitation. Well, what really changed that was this idea where you would heat check sows and then come back, say, a half hour to 45 minutes later and inseminate without the boar present. Because in those early studies, and I did some myself, we typically would see about a 90% passage rate through the cervix. And, frankly, that just wasn't good enough. So you have 1 out of every 10 sows, someone standing there with this catheter, frustrated, they can't pass it through the cervix. And so this concept of heat checking and coming back later to inseminate, that really made a huge difference. So that really was a game changer once that started to get perfected. Lining sows up in a row and no boar present, and inseminating was really counterintuitive to everything we'd all been taught.
Yes.
So that made a big difference. So also, I think that change sort of put an end to these ideas of embryo transfer and frozen semen. There was still a lot of hope at the time about embryo transfer, frozen semen for genetic improvement, but once the post-cervical insemination kind of got mastered, those things, for the most part, have kind of gone by the wayside.
Okay. Do you have a good idea of the percentage of, say, the U.S. industry, how much are using post-cervical?
I don't have a real good idea. Every 4 years at our Midwest Boar Stud Managers Conference, we try to, the group kind of comes up with an estimate. My guess right now is it's somewhere in the 50% adoption rate, because most people are not using it on gilts. Some are. A little bit difficult to get the exact same results for some systems on gilts for whatever reason. They have a much smaller cervix, a much tighter cervix, and this requires a lot more patience in time. So, but the reduced volume, this led to the reduced volume, and that's been the big thing that has really affected the boar stud. Is a lot of people are using somewhere between half and 2/3. I like to see kind of a 60 to 70% volume, just as for security and insurance. But that dramatically reduces the number of boars needed in the boar stud. So the whole infrastructure of the boar stud industry, the timing has kind of worked out well. A lot of boar studs that were built in the early and mid 90s. The facilities are starting to show their age. And that's allowed, especially some bigger systems to, just kind of mothball some of those facilities and service the same number of sows with a lot less boars and with a lot higher genetic value as well.
Yes, that's huge, right? Do you have an idea of how much, how much the genetic, and I guess that comes to your next point, maybe, is the estimated breeding value management. What are the changes there? And also how the post-cervical kind of influenced that?
Yeah, so that was my 5th change that I think has really been, when I look back over the last 25 years, in the mid-90s there, kind of when I got going, people would buy boars. If there was any categorization of boars, some companies would sell you, say, a top 10 boar versus a regular boar, AI boar. So if you paid a little more, you could get a boar in the top 10 off test. Otherwise, you got a boar in the 10 to 50th percentile was kind of a common way of doing it. Once you got the boar, that was it. You knew that you paid for a top 10 boar, but you had no idea how that boar compared to new boars coming off test. So what a lot of people did was they, in the early days, 50% replacement rate was really common. So very similar to a sow farm. And what they did was you brought in a new group of 20 boars, and you had a couple of deads. 18 went out the backside. You picked the 18 oldest boars, and that's what you did. Credit some of the genetic companies, for starting to share the indexes, but not only to share the index as the boars come off test, but to maintain that information in a global database and keep the indexes updated. That's just had a huge impact on the industry. Now you go to a boar stud, there's a lot wider range in age than there was 25 years ago, because you might have a boar that comes in, he may come in with a 160 index. Well, he's going to be around for quite a while. A guy that comes in at a 105, he's not going to be around that long, and that's the way it should be. The highest index boars on that day are the ones that should be kept in the boar stud, regardless of age, regardless of semen output. As long as they have decent semen quality and acceptable structure, that makes a whole lot more sense. That's really revolutionized how we're actually managing the boar studs. We're setting up collection schedules with the highest boar indexes that are scheduled, and then we have a reserve population of the low index boars, the boars that are kind of on deck to go out on the next cull truck. So that really changed a lot.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you about what is typical today. Well, I guess one is the replacement rate. What do you see today, average?
I would say a normal commercial terminal boars typically are running in the 70 to 80% replacement rate. And that's also a related change. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of drive for really high replacement rates. A lot of studs are running 100% replacement rate or more. What happened was we really didn't make that many pigs out of those high indexing boars, because the high indexing boars are typically the youngest boars, the ones coming in. But as we've bred boars to be more and more efficient, their maturation is later. So you might get boars delivered at, say, 6 months of age. They really don't make any significant number of pigs till, say, 11 or 12 months of age, because they're not producing much sperm, and the sperm they're producing isn't of very good quality. So usually it's not even acceptable as it goes through the lab at the boar stud. So there was kind of a balance put in place, I would say kind of late 2000s there, where people started to look at, how many pigs are actually being made and what's the ideal balance, and things got dialed back there to a more manageable level, where we actually can make a lot of pigs out of a high indexing boar, and not just be, forcing the use of young boars that don't really produce much sperm anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. Another question I have is, what's recommended frequency today? Once a week or twice, or what's the recommended?
Yeah, typically I like to see boars collected once a week, every week on the exact same day, without any alteration. There's been quite a bit of work in the past. Billy Flowers did a lot of the early work, showing that the majority, not all, but the majority of boars, if you start varying their collection schedule, it's actually a stress to the boar, and you'll have certain boars that'll start to have bad semen quality. Just from varying their schedules. So I think keeping them on once a week. If you have older boars, a really common schedule today is a 3 and 2 schedule. And so what a 3 is, it's 3 times collected in 2 weeks. So that would be like week 1, they'd be collected Monday, Friday. Week 2 would be Wednesday, then Monday, Friday, then Wednesday. And that gives you a consistent 4 or 5 day rest period. Not very many boar studs today are collecting twice a week. That was more common in the 90s when we were running 50% replacement rate. You might have some, boars that were, say, 2 to 3 years of age, And then oftentimes people would cull out the lower producing boars. So you'd have, a 3-year-old boar producing 35, 40 doses a collection, and going to twice a week was no problem. But I think today that's a lot less common. There's a lot more Duroc boars in the population the last couple of years. And the Duroc boars, and anytime we have purebred boars, they're just a lot more sensitive to stresses of collection schedule changes, of too frequent of collection, or of letting them go without collecting them. So we do need to see them on a consistent schedule.
Very interesting. Anything else on this topic before we move to the 3 questions, Dr. Reicks, that we ask every guest?
I think we covered most of it.
Very good. A lot of great knowledge there and experience from the last 25 years. So the first question is, what's your favorite pig-related book?
Well, one of the books that really had an impact on me early in my career, and while I was in vet school, it came out, is Vet Clinics of North America. There's a swine reproduction edition from the early 90s, and every once in a while I go back and skim through that, and it's incredible how a lot of that stuff is still in place today. Fundamentals are still in place. So I sort of like looking back at old publications and enjoy, finding some of the foreshadowing and insight that people had back then that was really ahead of their time.
That's super cool. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I was not familiar with that book. What is the favorite book that is not related to pig for you?
One of the books that I really like is called The Secret Race. Tyler Hamilton was a cyclist. I'm a passionate cyclist, and
that's cool.
That was sort of an unmasking of the ethical problems in the road cycling, and where someone kind of came clean and told the truth and had very high standards of ethics, and I think it's a really interesting book.
Very nice. Do you still cycle?
I do, yes.
Nice. That's cool. I used to. I need to get back to it. My longest one's being 112 miles and a lot of sweat.
Yeah.
It's therapy for sure.
Yeah.
And then the last one is, what do you think sets apart successful swine professionals from those who are not?
The thing I think sets successful professionals is that they're problem solvers, and they go about solving problems in an objective and scientific method, scientific matter, and are able to block out, some of the emotional or other types of, subjective consequences, and find the objective. What's the true answer? You might not be able to get to the true answer or implement based off the true answer, but to find a solution to the problem. And that's what I've tried to do throughout my career, is look at different things that cause people problems, or that cause production problems, and then dig in and try to find the true source of the problem and a solution.
Very nice. Problem solvers. Very cool. Dr. Reicks, well, I appreciate your time. This has been great. Like I say, very niche section there of the swine industry that's we certainly deserve more research in that area. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.